So this is the cloud migration session with a security focus. Obviously, when you're talking about migrating to AWS, security is job one for us, right? And job one for you when you're migrating. So we have my cohort here, Matt Yanchishin. He works on the ISV side. We're both in the partner organization, so he works on the ISV side. He is the resident security expert, at least for the next 30 minutes, right? Or the next hour.
There we go.
I'm Tom Leszewski. I work in the GSIs, so I work with the global systems integrators, the large partners like Accenture, Cognizant, TCS, Wipro, folks like that, helping them take enterprise customers onto AWS. So the first thing I'm going to start with, and I'm not going to bore you a lot with this stuff because we're at a technology conference, right? We're not at a business conference. So I'm not going to bore you with a lot of the people stuff, just pointing out, though, the fact that when you talk about migrations, really fear and experience play a lot into the migration. Technology, which we're going to be focusing a lot on today, including security, and process are a big part of it. So process is the migration process. But we're going to be focusing mostly on technology and process, although keep in mind the fact that the biggest inhibitor in most cases for people migrating is fear, not having the skill set, and really people not wanting to change. So what I'm going to focus on, and obviously Matt's going to fill in the security stuff, is I'm going to focus on a few things that I see when people are starting to migrate. Is one, they always talk about rehost and re-architect. And I want to dispel a little bit of myths around rehost and re-architect, and when you use what approach over another approach. The other one I often get is they say, Tom, I want to know very quickly, within the next 2 hours, I have 600 applications, how long is it going to take me to migrate? So I want to cover a little bit. I'm going to tell you how you can do that today by the end of the day. No, actually not. But I want to help you try to do that. The other one is data migration. To me, and I came from an Oracle background, data is huge in migrations. And I don't think people spend enough time about talking about how you migrate 20 terabytes of data or even petabytes of data. So I'm going to spend some time talking about data. And the fourth thing that I'm really focused on is where do you spend your time? I run into too many people that tell me that if I can just figure out how to migrate my VMware VM images, I'm done. Wow. To me, that's a small piece of what you have to do, and I'm going to explain why. So this is, and if you take a look at, and leading into what I just talked to you about, is what's involved in a migration, right? So if you take a look at this migration, there's one piece in there that says migrate. So, but there's a lot of other pieces that go into this. So you're going to spend your time doing the migration, but you're going to spend a lot of time up front figuring out what I want to migrate. You're going to spend a lot of time in the back end doing testing. You're going to figure out what's involved with your infrastructure. What kind of log management should I use? What kind of monitoring and management should I use? What kind of security platform am I going to architect? How am I going to migrate those security assets to AWS? So keep that, once again, drawing home my point, the fact that a migration, especially the compute and the storage, is a small component of the overall migration. So wow, building upon this. So to my second point, which my second point is people ask me, Tom, should I do a rehost or I should do a re-architect? Well, it really depends. This is a really cool slide, but you're not going to do this for every workload that you have. You're not going to all of a sudden take a look at 400 workloads and say, I have some SAP HANA, I have some Oracle databases, I have some Oracle ERP systems, and say, I'm going to do a rehost across all of my applications. I've just decided I'm going to do a rehost because I think that's a good way to go. What you're probably going to do is have a few apps, like a web app, maybe a Drupal app, which makes a lot of sense because it's sort of cloud ready by being a Drupal app. I'm going to do a rehost with that. Although taking this a step further in my argument, I'm going to even tell you that within that one application, you're probably not going to do a rehost for everything. And what I mean by that is you might rehost the data and the app, but you might do a re-architect on, say, the load balancer. You might move from, say, an F5 load balancer to ELB. Or you might move from a block level storage into S3. So even within that one application, I would argue that you're not specifically going to do a rehost or re-architect. So take this slide with a grain of salt. Once again, in this slide, you see there's a lot of stuff going on here in terms of UAT, penetration testing, unit testing that's happening, not just moving the compute side of it. So the next thing we're going to talk about, and there's the one component of it which is the migration, and the other component is the end-state architecture. Taking a look at this, once again, what we see here is we see a small section on here. In fact, if you look on here, we don't see anything about compute. We see a little bit about storage. One thing I want to touch about, obviously Matt is going to give you everything you need to know in the world about security and when you migrate and how you set up your end-state architecture. But take a look at VPC and account configuration, a big component. You've got to figure out, am I going to have one big VPC? Am I going to have a VPC per application? Or, and at the end, I'm going to give you a case study of Condé Nast, where they actually put everything into one VPC and manage the security through IAM, through security groups, and through subnets. So they had specific subnets for test, dev, and QA and production, right, instead of having one VPC. The other big dilemma is accounts. Should every developer have their own AWS account? So they use IAM, and Matt's going to clear all that up for us. So, same things in terms of governance, billing and cost management. If you are at the conference, you've been there today, you've been looking at all the partners we have, partners play a huge role in the migration. In fact, there's a number of partners, a lot of them, they're all called cloud for some reason. There's Cloud Health, Cloud Checker, Cloudability. I don't know, there's Seal Cloud? That doesn't start with cloud, though. So there's a bunch of them that help you do cost management. Obviously, we have Trusted Advisor to do that as well. And then on the other side, take a look at all the people. PagerDuty. They do alerting for you. The fact that they're called PagerDuty, that's pretty weird, isn't it? A pager. Who actually had a pager way back when?
Still do.
So you have a pager? You're under 35. You shouldn't have a pager. I should have a pager. I start carrying around that big cell phone that you used to carry around now. So alerting and notifications. You see Datadog, you see AppDynamics, you see Loggly, you see a bunch of vendors out there. They're going to play a role as well. Or you could use some of the old school stuff if you're running on-prem like CA and BMC to do some of those things. All right, and speaking of that, here is going back to this idea of rehost or re-architect. Remember I told you that within one application, you might be doing a rehost for the virtual compute, but you might not for some of these other components, right? For the network, you're going to have to set up a VPN. Well, you might use a Cisco VPN. You might use Juniper. You might use something else. So in that case, if you're switching VPN providers or switching vendors, or maybe you're using OpenSwan or something like that, right? Then in that case, you're doing a re-architect. By that means. Same thing with load balancer, I mentioned that. If you're going to use, you can use an F5 software appliance on our technology, but you could move to ELB. So compute, databases, what else do we have up there? Cluster management as well. So if you move to auto-scaling, that's not as application intrusive, but if you move to auto-scaling, once again, you're extending your architecture, not necessarily just doing a plain lift and shift. Storage, we just saw the big announcement today, right? So how do you support shared storage? This is a big one. Matt, we run into this all the time, right? I got terabytes of data. I got petabytes of data. I want a shared storage on AWS. Have a lot of partners out there, SoftNAS, but we just announced it because it's a big thing. Once again, if you're going to move to our platform and not use something on-prem, you're actually changing your architect. Here's some more of the areas. Caching is a big one, right? You could use our Elastic Cache. You could use Redis that you're using on-prem already. Email services, we just announced our email service that you could use. And in the development integration space, a lot of people are using things like Ansible, Salt, Chef, Puppet. You could continue to use those, but we're offering a lot of solutions in that space to do continuous integration in the form of code pipeline, continuous deployment in the form of code deploy. So obviously security comes first, so Matt's going to talk about security.
Thanks, Tom. So in this particular context, when we're talking about migration, the key thing to understand is that there's really enormous opportunity for our partner ecosystem and security specifically. We work with a lot of partners. We do a lot of work, AWS, to really provide a foundation that you can build upon. And we do a lot of work specifically with auditors, with different compliance boards, and to attain different certifications so that you can move to the cloud with confidence. And I've been with AWS about 3 years now, and it's amazing how the conversation has changed. Even a year or two ago, we would have that tough first security conversation. It was always the first conversation, and it still is. But what's changed is that now people say, how can I improve my security posture by moving to the cloud? It's been flipped on its head. People always used to be nervous about security in the cloud, and it's a totally different story now. You know how expensive and hard it is to get these certifications, to attain them, to keep them updated, to hire auditors? It's incredible operational overhead, incredible cost. So there's opportunity, really, for becoming leaner and meaner and focusing on your core business by moving to AWS, because we take care of a lot of this stuff for you, especially if you're in heavily regulated industries, healthcare, life sciences, finance, government. We have certifications and compliance regimes in all of these spaces. We do that groundwork. But there's also opportunity in there for partners, because yes, we have ISO 27001, or you can build PCI level 1 compliant applications for retail credit card transactions on AWS, but you still have to build them. And it's actually pretty hard. HIPAA is a good example. You can sign a BAA with AWS and run HIPAA compliant workloads on AWS across many of our services. But actually following the guidelines correctly, doing it correctly such that it'll stand up to an audit and that it'll be good for your customers is hard. And we really leverage our partners to do that. We have teams internally that help our customers do that, but we look to our partners to extend and enhance our customer experience, because we can't touch everybody, and some of our partners have really domain-specific opportunities. So each of those logos there, we have little clusters of partners, little ecosystems that help our customers attain compliance as needed. Then, of course, there's the rest of it. When you make a migration, there's a lot that you have to think about. And to Tom's point earlier, it's not just about the VMs. It's not just about the storage. It's about thinking, are you going to lift and shift? Are you going to re-architect? And importantly, the first thing to ask for every one of those boxes and more is, how can I do this in a secure and compliant way? So we have a bunch of tools internally at AWS to help you attain your goals in terms of security. The key thing really for us is visibility. And I think this theme is reflected in a lot of the services that we've come out with and the features in the last year or two. Things like CloudWatch, CloudTrail especially, AWS Config. Anyone who's worked in security, compliance, and migration in general will know that the key to success is knowing what is happening at any given time. To be able to reach in and check in on the operation metrics of your environment, but not only that, to know what's happened in the past, to have an audit trail. And so CloudTrail is essential, as is AWS Config, to have these snapshots, these point-in-time snapshots and ongoing operational metrics from CloudWatch and elsewhere that give you visibility in terms of what is happening, so you can identify anomalies, know what's going on, and know where things have come from. I treat security like code, and I should be able to roll back security just like I can roll back a software release. All of the agile principles, continuous integration, continuous deployment, they apply to security and they apply to migrations as well. We're going to see this later with Condé Nast. They took a phased approach. If a phase fails, you roll it back. You refactor, you try again. It's not a lift and shift. It's never that. It's the same with security. You attempt things, some things work, some things don't. We're moving too fast to do anything otherwise. Control, of course, is the other big one. And this is especially important in pharma, for example, healthcare, life sciences. Control around processes. And again, auditability. You're starting to see a theme. So we have a lot of services like identity and access management, and a lot of new services around encryption that we'll talk about in a second. Cloud HSM, key management services, to allow you to control who can see your data, who can work on the data, who can do what, who can go where. So let's dive a little bit more deep. We have the compliance programs, the third-party attestations for our certifications that I talked about earlier. Then we have the whole networking layer, we'll dig into in the following slides. One thing that's really core to understand about AWS is when you move to a cloud model, to an AWS model, fundamentally your security the security perimeter shrinks. And that doesn't mean it gets smaller. It means that the rules and the bounds that you put on your infrastructure get shrunk wrap around individual nuggets of your infrastructure. So instead of having big honking firewalls or threat analytics systems sitting in front of your span port, for example, you have things like security groups and other tools and techniques, partner solutions, agents living on instances. You have the security footprint shrink around the VMs themselves, around each little module and component of your architecture. And once you kind of understand that, then you start to really understand how security is both improved in the cloud and how it just works fundamentally. No longer think of overall networks. Don't think of span ports. Don't think of these one solution to fit them all across the entire perimeter of your data center. Think about each individual component of your architecture, how you can monitor it as a whole, and how you can secure each one individually to suit the needs of that piece of your application. So encryption is a good example. You don't need encryption everywhere. You need a modular, flexible system that allows you to encrypt things both at rest and in transit for different purposes. If you encrypt everything everywhere, you're going to take a performance hit. And the first thing I always ask people when they're migrating is, okay, sure, maybe you were encrypting everything before, you probably weren't. And now you're asking, well, I'll just encrypt everything. We have a lot of strong controls in AWS, a lot of certification, a lot of processes in place such that you don't need to encrypt everything. We can look at tokenization, which where you kind of mask the data a little bit. We can look at segmenting your data so you only encrypt what's needed. And why is this important? Well, because there's overhead associated with encryption. And there's operational overhead and performance overhead. If you hit that nice, beautiful tick box on the Redshift cluster for encryption, for example, you get encryption, but you also take about a 10 to 15, sometimes 20% performance hit. And so you have to ask yourself, what am I encrypting? What data is in there? Can I change this data such that the data doesn't need to be encrypted because there are controls in place already? Or can I segment the data so that only data that is sensitive gets encrypted? So be smart about encryption. And importantly, from the operational overhead perspective, leverage the managed services that AWS has. You don't have to necessarily bring your encryption from on-premises. You can perhaps take care of something for a lot less money by using our key management service, by using Cloud HSM, and have a very, very secure environment, fully secured environment with a lot less cost, a lot less operational overhead than before. It applies to many services. It's not just the key services for encryption. It's also the services themselves, like S3 with server-side encryption or customer-managed keys, RDS for encryption, for TDE, for example, with Oracle. You have a lot of options, many of which are available on premises and many of which are cloud native that are, in fact, an improvement on your encryption posture. This is really key to understand, is firewalls. When we're giving the one-on-one talk, we always say, think of a security group like a firewall. It's only sort of true. The easy way to understand it, and I think an important way to understand security groups, is really as kind of a whitelist. And the big difference between a firewall traditionally on premises and a security group in the cloud is that a security group, again, has that shrunk perimeter. Security groups can apply to individual instances or groups of instances. So it actually gives you a lot more flexibility. Instead of having a firewall sitting at the edge of your subnet, you have a firewall sitting on every single host in the form of a security group in your environment. And that changes things. It actually makes things a lot more flexible, opens up possibilities. So think of security group as a host-level firewall with a little bit more flexibility for whitelisting traffic. Think of a network ACL, which you would probably use a lot more on premises, as something that A, is optional, and B, can be used for blacklisting. Specifically, I don't want anybody FTPing out of this subnet. I use NACLs for blacklisting and for isolating subnets, and I use security groups as essentially host-based firewalls. It's important to know, though, that we can't do everything, and we really lean on our partner network, especially in the ISV space, to fill in the gaps in terms of firewalls specifically and other sort of network security-based areas. Alert Logic, for example, has a wonderful web application firewall. You can't use security groups to do blanket blacklists. There are simply limits in terms of the amount of rules and lists you can do. And if you want to have very fine-grained sort of F5 style big IP rules, those kind of massive sets of rules can't be handled by our tools, so we look to our partners for those. That's just one example. VPN is another that Tom brought up. You can use VPC peering, you can use the VPN, the IPsec VPN on our virtual gateways for VPC. But if you have a really complex situation where you have a bunch of customers, say a bunch of affiliates that need to all be connected via VPN into AWS, that kind of large-scale VPN is better handled by, for example, a Cisco cloud router, a CSR router, which you can use on AWS. The key takeaway here is chances are the VPN solution and the network security solution that you're using today on premises is already available on the AWS marketplace, and you can migrate it and use it in software form on AWS today. If you combine that with the added functionality of security groups and NACLs, then you actually have an improved footprint with not much change. Your Cisco guys can continue to use Cisco in the cloud, your Juniper people, your Fortinet people, those are all available for AWS. So pass it back to Tom.
Thanks, Matt. That was a really good point, especially coming from the Oracle background, Oracle TDE, transparent data encryption. You wouldn't want to encrypt your entire EBS storage because with TDE, it gives you granular control. You can encrypt like at a row level or a column level. So using something like that, you should probably just if you're using it on-prem, just continue to use it on AWS. I think the other thing that was on your slide that really caught me was that we're offering now where you can have your own keys for like S3 and a lot more of our storage. So what we used to have, a lot of times when people migrated, they're like, oh, it's great that S3 has server-side encryption, but I want my own keys. Or they'd be like, well, but you could do client-side encryption. And they're like, I don't want to write that. I don't want to do that. But it's great that they can use their own keys. So just a couple of points on that. So I told you and I promised you that I was going to talk a little bit about how long does it take to migrate and some of the best practices around migration. Obviously, the first point is a pretty obvious point. Standalone applications. I mentioned a Drupal application, websites. Of course, if you take a look at Coca-Cola, you take a look at Unilever, you take a look at Dow Jones, you take a look at a lot of these companies that have chosen to migrate. If you take a look at their first workloads that they migrate, a lot of them are websites, standalone websites that are easy to, JBoss-based, MySQL-based websites. So that's pretty easy. Loosely coupled applications. If you have a very tightly coupled application, when I made tightly coupled, if you're doing database level integration at, say, at like a PL SQL at Oracle level, it's probably not good because it's going to be migrating, or it's going to be talking to all these different databases on-prem, and you probably can't move everything at once. So if it's a tightly coupled application, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Low-hanging fruit. We see a lot of people, like I mentioned, LAMP stack applications, websites, content management systems, social media products, things like that. Training environments. We have a company that's been very successful, DLCP, migrating PeopleSoft training organizations onto AWS. Things to watch out for. 32-bit applications. I think now, and I could be wrong, was it 3? I think we have 3 instance types that support 32-bit. And they don't have a lot of CPU and RAM. So we're obviously not big into supporting the 32-bit platform, so you've got to be careful about that. Obviously, if you're running something like Solaris or AIX, you have to do a migration to Linux first, and Condé Nast will actually talk about that a little bit. Oracle RAC. We don't support multicast on our network, so there are some options to do Oracle RAC, but you've got to be aware of that. Client-server applications tend to not lend themselves to the web. I mean, you can use something like Citrix in order to web-enable that client-server application, but you have to be aware that it's not just going to port over. Engineered systems, obviously things like Netezza, Oracle Exadata. You could, but this would be a re-engineering effort. It's not going to be a rehost. You can't just take your Exadata machine and run it in one of our Direct Connect facilities, although that's a pretty good idea. Maybe we should talk to Oracle about that. We do have the capability to run NetApp inside of our Direct Connect facility, so why not a Netezza machine? And then vertically challenged applications and software. These are more old school applications and software. Being a little bit old school myself, actually Micro Focus COBOL had a runtime engine that you couldn't scale out at all. So they didn't allow any type of horizontal scaling, so you have to scale it vertically. And then with the fact that we don't have any instance types that have over 256 of memory, that could be a little bit of an issue. So minimum effort. So I love this and I hate this. I'm going to say this jokingly a little bit, but I get this a lot and you'd be surprised. And this is very true. I got an email from a big GSI. I'm not going to name the name. I'm not going to disparage them. That said, I have about 5,000 VMs and I have about 2 petabytes of data. How long is it going to take me to migrate? I'll be right on that. I'll get you an answer tomorrow. So this is the minimum that information you would need to know, right? Obviously, you need to know compute, but you also need to know the OS. They didn't really tell me the OS right away. I had to sort of get that out of them. And what they told me is they had Red Hat. And I said, oh, great, you have Red Hat. You can move to Amazon Linux and save yourself a little money. They said, no, we need to continue to use Red Hat. So okay, that's fine. We can do Red Hat. So they got Red Hat and they got Windows, so I know that now. Need to do the boot drive size, because that's important. I need to know the storage. So I not only need to know the storage, obviously 2 petabytes doesn't tell me anything. Well, half of that could be indexes on an Oracle database. So a lot of it could be stuff that's not even used anymore. A lot of it could be videos and stuff that's going to be produced or distributed off of a website, right? Is it archival? Is it tape? Is it long-term storage? Because a lot of people on-prem, they just use a glob of storage to do everything. Backups, databases, recovery, archiving, everything. So I have to know. I have to know the region because that impacts. And data transfer out, your networking costs, right? Because the three major components into making a cost estimate on AWS in terms of where you're going to run it, and it does impact your migration costs, is the compute, is the storage, is the network out traffic. And then do you need a dedicated network? I mean, that's a big thing. So can you use VPN over the network, over the internet in order to secure your environment, or do you need something like Direct Connect? So that's a minimum amount of information. The next level up is if I want to give you a better estimate of both runtime costs and migration costs, is to know these things. So your backup requirements. Can you use something like EBS snapshots, or do you need to use something like Commvault, or do you need to use something like Oracle RMAN in order to back up? HA requirements. Do you need Route 53? Do you need a load balancer? So I can figure that out as well. Scalability requirements. Do you need to run in multiple AZs? Should I use something like CloudFront? DR requirements. This is where it gets a little interesting, because from a DR perspective, now when you're on AWS, you don't need to do the traditional DR scenario, which is basically backup and restore. Now you can use high availability multi-AZ and have a different type of DR, which actually your HA or DR becomes sort of one and the same. So that's something I need to know. Storage IOPS. Obviously, something like provision IOPS is going to have an impact on your costs, both from a migration perspective and a runtime perspective. And then management and monitoring software. When you start running all this management and monitoring software on AWS, you're probably going to have EC2 instances that are running that software. So that's going to drive up both your cost of your migration and your runtime cost. So the really nice thing to have is actually give me a stratification, and we'll talk a little bit about how Condé Nast did this, is stratify your apps. And it's up to you how to stratify them, but here's an example of how I might stratify them into file servers, into things that run security and identity management, RDMS, Oracle, SQL Server, things like that, things that run ERP, big data. I have security there twice. I don't know if that was a mistake or the fact that I really wanted you to talk about that. It's really important. Layers of security, I like that. And then we have management and monitoring groups. Do I need HIPAA and PCI compliant? Because HIPAA, you're going to have to run on dedicated instances inside of AWS, so I need to know that. And then extreme CPU and memory. Take a look at something like SAP HANA. That's going to take a lot of requirements. I need to know if you're running something like SAP HANA. And then third party and packages. Are you running a WAF? Are you running IDS, IPS? How are you going to do that inside of AWS? So that gives you an even better idea of what your migration costs are going to be. So the proof of concept, and I know sometimes people shy away from proof of concepts, and a lot of times it's because you have to get hardware, you have to configure it. On AWS, you obviously don't need to do that, right? So we do recommend a proof of concept. We do this with almost every GSI that we work with, and we go out to a customer, we do a proof of concept. It's easy to do. If you're working with a GSI partner, we have actually funding to a POC to pay for those AWS services, which is really nice. And it gives you a good idea of both the migration estimation cost and figure out whether your approach is even going to work or not. And then obviously it gives you an idea of what the AWS runtime costs are going to do. All right, speaking about migrating the data, I have this in bullet point form, and then I have it on a little metrics, if you will. So some things that you could potentially use in order to do, and I'll tell you when to use which one based on sort of your velocity of data and how much data you have on the next slide. But just to start with, I mean, you can start with just file transfer. If you don't have a lot of data, just FTP, secure FTP the stuff up. You can use UDP. UDP is a lot less, it's a lot faster than using something like FTP, right? Interesting, this second one is NFS mount. I had someone that was migrating a Oracle PeopleSoft application. They try to use a lot of these different methods, and they found actually mounting an NFS drive on AWS. And what that saves you is writing this information multiple times, right? You're just writing it once. Although it's going to be a little bit slow writing it that first time. Once you get it over there, you just do it once. You don't have to continue to move this data around and get it into S3 and then get it onto an EBS volume and then mount that volume to Oracle or whatever it may be. So you can use a backup application, Commvault, Riverbed, and we got corrected yesterday on this as well. Riverbed is now SteelStore. It's part of NetApp, but we continue because in our hearts it's still called Riverbed. We can't change, can we, Matt?
It says that on the side of their building.
And so that's an appliance that allows you to stream that data just like the storage gateway over to AWS. And then you could use the storage gateway. You could use import-export. You could use a database backup utility. This is actually an approach that a lot of people don't think of. where you back up your database using something like RMAN, Oracle, right? Ship that database, and then you keep track of those archive logs, and then when you go live, you just apply all those archive logs into the Oracle database. So that's a method that we've seen a number of people use. You can also use replication tools like Golden Gate. DB Visit is sort of a cheaper version of Golden Gate. You can use Active Data Guard, so you can use tools like that. And then, of course, I would say Direct Connect shouldn't be like a separate entity. It should be across these different methods, and I'll show you what I mean on this slide. So this is putting all those things I talked about in the previous slide into how much data you have and how much velocity. When I say velocity, how much changes do you have to the data? I'll bring this up in the Condé Nast, and they address this in a pretty cool way, and not using a lot of what I put up here except Storage Gateway they did use, and they did use Direct Connect. But velocity means how often did that data change. So imagine this. I have a 50 terabyte database. A 50 terabyte database. Do I want to, when I go production live, do I want to try to back up that database, send the tapes to AWS, and then import everything? No. What I want to do is I want to capture it at some given point in time, 2 weeks before I go live, and then stream those changes over. And that's why if you take a look at the upper left-hand corner, you'll see that a one-time upload with constant delta upgrades. And I'll show you how Condé Nast did that. I mean, once again, this goes back to the fact that you use Golden Gate, use Active Data Guard, use tools like that in order to synchronize that data. And then, of course, if you have a massive amounts of data, something like NetApp SteelStore is a good solution to stream that data over to AWS. So keep in mind, it's the size of the data and the change of the data, and also keep in mind it just doesn't impact how long that migration of the data takes. It impacts your production cutover. So if your production cutover is only 24 hours or 8 hours, you need to make sure that you're not going to just do a snap of your data, 20 terabyte database, and then ship that over to AWS and expect to be up in 8 hours. All right, security.
Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we talked about some of the ways, the tools that we have at your disposal and that partners can sort of augment for security. But let's talk about some more specific best practices when you're thinking about migrating to the cloud and migrating to AWS. I mentioned this earlier, again, about shrinking the security perimeter, about thinking more about smaller units in terms of VMs or databases that you can secure individually rather than at the subnet or network level or even physical data center level. It's much more granular than that in AWS. So that also applies to how you implement the security solutions. Tom mentioned intrusion detection and intrusion prevention, IDS and IPS, and that's something that we don't offer and that we really look to our partners for. I see some of you in the audience, some of the partners and customers that we've worked with in the past, and we recommend solutions like Trend Micro, for example, with their deep security suite, Alert Logic, and others, and they can fill some of these gaps. But what makes these different from the implementations on premises, again, is that rather than sit at the firewall level or at the subnet or network level, they're host-based. And it really goes for not just security, but a lot of things, whether it's log aggregation or log collection, IDS, IPS, any virus. Try to move as much as possible to host-based agents. And if you do that, you'll have much, much easier time in your migration. Trying to do sort of network level, subnet level things is just going to be a recipe for disaster, quite frankly. It's going to slow you down. Think host-based and think disposable. If you can dispose of instances and not have it affect your infrastructure, and if you can deploy your security solutions in the form of host-based agents on your instances, you will have an easier migration, I promise. So then you have to think about your continuous delivery and continuous integration pipeline, or most people don't have that, just your deployment guy. And you have to retrain or refactor your pipeline such that when you go to deploy, you deploy those agents in the form of bootstrapping or as a container or as a pre-baked AMI or just another process line that you have. So think about host-based for security solutions and elsewhere. Another common mistake we see in migration is really making too much public. Web servers, for example. It may seem strange to say at first, but web servers don't need to be public-facing. They don't need to be attached to the IGW. They don't need to be in a public subnet. Why? Because you shouldn't. It's really hard to secure instances against attacks. And most of the time, let us do that. Put them behind an ELB. Put them behind CloudFront. Make that the public face of your application. And then put your web servers and the application servers in private subnets far away from the public face of the nasty internet. So move essential components away from the edge. Public cloud is a bit of a misnomer. You can have your private cloud on AWS There's no need to put critical application components with public IPs, almost always. You confront them with managed services that are hardened and well secured, like ELB, like CloudFront. And sometimes you don't even need a public face at all. You can use Direct Connect, to Tom's point, and use total private address space and have it connected securely to your colo or indirectly to your premises with Direct Connect and have no public IPs at all. So consider that. Think about that approach. And then a lot of those security problems that you were thinking about grappling with, how am I going to prevent against DDoS attacks and stuff like that, it kind of goes away. And the onus falls on us, and we do a really good job in those areas. Identity and access management is also something that I think from a migration perspective, people struggle with at the beginning because they have an incorrect understanding of what it is. And first and foremost, identity and access management is not a replacement for your Active Directory today. We see this a lot where people go and create a bunch of users in IAM for every Bob, Mary, Joe in their company, and then they're like, why can't I create any more users? It's because there are limits. It's not meant to be sort of a user repository or an identity store at all. There are great partner solutions for that, or like Microsoft, like Active Directory. IAM is much more than that, and it's different. It's not an identity store. It's a way to secure resources and provide roles that you can use identity federation to give access to your environment. And that's just a fancy way of saying, keep using LDAP or Active Directory or whatever you're using today, and have a backend system federate and assume roles, assume a set of credentials, a set of security permissions, so that the person uses the same single sign-on as before and just assumes through roles a set of credentials that lets them do what they need to do and only what they need to do on the cloud. But IAM is not just about humans, despite the logo with the little people. It's mostly about APIs and about computers and resources and VMs and things in your network. So use IAM roles, again, for example, as a way to no longer use credentials and store credentials on your boxes. This may require some refactoring of your code, but chances are you have some code lying around with hard-baked credentials in the code, or you have configuration files on your VMs with credentials that you use to access some API service. In the AWS context, you don't need to do that. You can apply a role to your EC2 instances, and when you execute applications that use the AWS SDK, they assume the role and assume the credentials automatically, and you don't have to hard bake in credentials anyway. That way, if you ever have a compromise, that compromise doesn't mean your credentials were stolen, because you can't steal a role. IAM also allows you to do multi-factor authentication, and I can't tell you, I give the Getting Started webinar, and this is actually what I start with. When you open an AWS account, enable multi-factor authentication. You can do it for your phone. I have Google Authenticator, AWS Virtual MFA. I use Duo, which is a great company for MFA. If you do that, then it's really, really hard to break into your account or do anything. Because when you log in with a username and password, it says, hey, where's your phone? Where's your key fob? And it requires that second factor of authentication before you can go in there. But again, it's not just for humans. We had this situation for a large financial services company that came out with a service a few years ago, and they had a requirement that they couldn't delete objects once they were put into S3. It's actually pretty common in kind of the audit and financial world. If you put a record of a stock trade in S3, that record has to be there forever, and you shouldn't be able to delete that record. It should be a write once, read, well, I jokingly call it write once, read never. Write once, read only repository. And how do we do that? Well, you can use multi-factor authentication. And so what you do is you say, for a delete operation on S3, you need to have that second factor of authentication. AWS, the API, will prompt you to say, what's the temporary code on your phone or on the key fob? And you give that key fob or the phone to a trusted third party. So that way, if you want to go delete something, you actually have to call an agreed third party, and they're going to say no, because that's their job. And it's one way to get creative with IAM and multi-factor authentication to lock down your environment. We sort of touched on this, but always think of terms of principle of least privilege. This was with security groups and with NACLs before. Basically, always say no. This is my principle in life. Start by saying no and convince me to say yes. Same with IAM. When you design your security policies, start with no everywhere and then let the yeses in. Give people permissions for only what they need to do when they need to do it. Make it temporary whenever possible, so you have rotating credentials, and have really, really fine-grained, restricted S3 bucket policies, IAM policies. The good news is we made it much easier recently. Now we have managed AWS policies for IAM, and that means that before you had to maintain policies for every user, for every group, for every role, and these would kind of drift and get out of sync. Now you can apply, for example, like an S3 read-write policy that AWS manages to a group of people or a group of roles or a role. And as that policy may change over time, we update it, and it automatically filters down to your group or role that it was assigned to. So role management, policy management in IAM and elsewhere used to be really tough. It's a lot easier now. We treat roles like first-class citizens now, just like users and groups and roles in IAM. Or policies, rather, like first-class citizens. Anyway, we covered this about least privilege. When you're logging into AWS, use IAM. When you open an account, take that root account that you created, put MFA on it, and then say bye-bye. Never touch it again. I tell this story about this partner I was working with, and I think this is the best security solution I've ever heard in my life. They were managing 1,000+ accounts, and they enabled multi-factor authentication against every one of them. And they were like, this was really hard. I have literally a box with 1,000 of these, Gemalto token things, and it's a real pain to go through this. And also, it's not secure. Someone could go. So what they did is they gave that box of tokens to a third party, and they literally have a person they can call. And when they log into an instance, they call a number, and they say, yeah, I'm calling, and you have to answer some challenge response questions. And then, the little old man or little old lady on the other end of the call literally reads the number off the key phone once you identify yourself. That's their second factor of authentication. And you know what? It was way cheaper than the complicated software solution they would have had to architect otherwise. So it can be old school, it can be new school, but it should always be secure. Consolidate your users. Don't create a user for everything. Think about groups and roles instead of individual users for individual action. And most importantly, just be careful about how you write your policies. Use the AWS management policies whenever possible. And this is the real takeaway here, is treat your IAM policies and S3 bucket policies just like you treat your code. We always talk about architecture or infrastructure as code. It's kind of a buzzword thing to say, but it's true in terms of security. Now you can check your security profiles, your policies, into your code repository, into Git or whatever, alongside your code and alongside your CloudFormation templates that define your infrastructure. So you can truly have security as code, infrastructure as code, and code as code living together and have versions and rollbacks, again, just like you would with your software. So always remember when you're implementing your AWS policies that we control the bulk of it, but we don't control the why. So when you're making the migration, really think hard about roles and responsibilities, how you can narrow the security perimeter, have the principle of least privilege everywhere, and then implement it using IAM, security groups, NACLs, and otherwise. And just be cautious. It's always better to say no first. We talked about federation already. This is where you can use existing identity stores like Active Directory coupled with IAM to give access to resources. You can also give access to the AWS Management Console. We have a SAML endpoint for our Management Console, and you can also use great third parties like Ping or Okta or Auth0 to have universal SSO to all of your applications, including the AWS Management Console and APIs. And then when you federate, when you authenticate against an identity service or against Active Directory or whatever, and you inherit those credentials, then you can go do your work, and the work is defined by the group that you're in and the rules that apply to that group. It's a really different model than on-premises, and there's no way around it. You got to put a lot of thought into it. But ultimately, you'll have a more secure solution, a more flexible solution, and certainly something that's a lot more cloud-friendly.
Thanks, man. Just a point on that, because I looked at it before we came into the session, and it said introductory. So one thing, just on a point of that, on the directory thing, is that that's not for your application. It's one of the questions we often get when people migrate. They're like, oh, I'm going to use directory service, directory connect and store all my application users inside of Active Directory and then connect to it. This is for connecting to our backplane, for using our command line interface, for using our SDKs, for using our console. So just wanted to point that out. I'm very excited about this case study. It's always good to have a case study. We wish we had the customer right in front of us right here. But this is a really good example of a migration. And actually, it's not just doing workload migration or application migration like the session said. It's actually shutting down a data center. So if you haven't gone up on YouTube and haven't watched the video, it's a really cool video. In fact, you get to see them taking the Sun blades out of the data center, stacking them, and shipping them out of the data center. So it's a really cool video. But Condé Nast, so here's the data center that they shut down. So they were under pressure to upgrade this data center. They're like, why are we in the data center business anymore? They were going to spend a bunch of money in order to do that. So there was a really motivating, and it's always good to have like a motivating, factor for someone to do some migrations. Otherwise, people just sit on it and go, well, I'll do that next year. In this case, there wasn't a next year. They're like, we got to get rid of this data center. So if you take a look at their applications, this is very fascinating, I think, because what I talked about is that sort of low-hanging fruit and stuff that's sort of easy to move, move a bunch of websites, a bunch of content management, some video servers and stuff like that. This was not low-hanging fruit by any means. A lot of PeopleSoft. If you go through the index of the what, it says here 350 servers, a lot of PeopleSoft stuff, a lot of SQL Server stuff, a lot of SharePoint applications, a lot of identity management, CA identity management servers, MySQL, Active Directory. So these are enterprise level applications that we're migrating, moving over to AWS. A lot of data there, not petabytes, but 400 terabytes of data is a pretty good amount. So this is where I said they stratified into 47 different application groups. So they figured out for each group, what was their migration strategy. So the methodology was to take an inventory, right? You need to figure out what you have, classic inventory. There's a lot of tools out in the marketplace that do some automated discovery, and you always want to use tools, but what they found at the end of the day was to use good old spreadsheets. And so they used spreadsheets. They took a look at how they were going to, the order that they were going to do the migration in, and how they basically did that. And this is very interesting as well, pretty fascinating, is they looked at the environment, how mission critical it was, right? Could that application be down for a few hours? Could we take some hit when we're actually doing the production cutover? What they also looked at, and I told you this already, you should take a look at how many integration points you had. So they rated each application on how many different integration points it had. And the third factor, get this, was whether it was running an Oracle database or not. So one of the biggest determining factors of whether we should migrate it first or later is if it was running Oracle. If it was running Oracle, it had a lot of integration points, and it couldn't be down, it was one of the last to move. So that was a pretty interesting thing about how they sort of taken a look at the criticality and what to move first. So the virtual machines, we talked about this, right? And there's a lot of tools out in the marketplace in terms of migrating. And I thought this approach was pretty cool. But because it uses Veeam, and if you take a look at some of the players in the marketplace that do migrations, Cloud Velox is another one. They actually have their legacy, sort of their history in DR. Same thing with Veeam, is they allow you DR solutions. So what they address, and I talked about this, is they address the fact that you can then synchronize, right? You do that backup using Veeam, and then you can synchronize, because they have a DR solution that synchronizes that VM back to the S3, the actual virtual image stored inside of S3. So that addresses that whole idea of the velocity of data. It also addresses the whole production cutover. So if you have an Oracle database that has a lot of data in it, or a file server that has a lot of data, you're constantly syncing. So what they did is they used Veeam with the AWS storage gateway to push that data over and then get the synchronization over. And then they used AWS import-export API in order to convert that VM machine over into an AMI format, right? And what they found out is that this would address these two ideas of data velocity and how to do your production cutover. So I thought it was a really cool solution. The other thing is that for large databases, they end up using tools like RMAN, like Golden Gate in order to do database migration. So for the application, for the VMs, they used one approach, which was Veeam Storage Gateway and AWS Import-Export. And for large databases, they used another approach. They also used Direct Connect. And the thing to keep in mind about Direct Connect that some people forget is if you're moving a lot of data, it can actually be, price comparative-wise, it can be just as good as VPN and internet. The other thing to keep in mind is in the past, you had to buy Direct Connect, and you could only get it at like 1 gigabit per second or 10 gigabits. Now you can get down to 50 megabits per second, and you can buy it for just a temporary amount of time. So that's great for migration, right? Just buy, if you only need 100 megabits per second, use it for 3 weeks, and then don't use it anymore. So they did use Direct Connect, and they also, overlapping IP, especially when you use VPC peering. You got to be very careful about overlapping IPs, so they were very cautious about that. IAM, so Matt, did you know this slide was in here? I don't know if you did or not, but they used IAM. So they're using your best practices, Matt, here inside of here. And they use groups and permissions. Application tagging, I don't know if you talked about it too much, very important from a cost billing perspective. And also an access perspective, because we have resource level permissions now. So if some application is tagged as production, and an IAM user doesn't have the ability to, say, shut down an instance that's tagged production. So tagging is hugely important, and it's something you always need to do, both from a security perspective and a cost billing perspective. And they did a phased approach. So like I said, they used Veeam to do that synchronization to S3, and then grabbed that image. It was still inside a VMware format, pulled that down into a cluster of EC2 instances that are running SSD drives to speed up the migration. Because one component of the VM import that takes a lot of time, it does take a lot of time to convert that image over, right? So what you do is you pull that out of S3, and one of the reasons they converted it on AWS is that now you can use the power of AWS, which is basically spinning up a lot of instances. On-prem, you're going to spin up 500 instances to do that VM convert. So that's what they did there. And then considerations, here's some things about VM import-export that they have to work around. We don't support volumes larger than a terabyte, so they spread it across multiple volumes. I also like this one, right? These couple, they were forced to do it. Now here's another thing that I talked a little bit about when you re-architect. Do you re-architect before you migrate, or do you re-architect after you migrate? So there's a philosophy that says, do a lift and shift and then sort of tweak your application. In this case, they didn't have a lot of choice because they had some things that weren't virtualized, so they needed to virtualize them before they migrated. And they had some unsupported OSs, so they had to actually do that sort of re-architect before they migrated to AWS. So this I like too, going back to my first slide, right? And remember in my first slide, I said we weren't going to talk a lot about people. But look at some of these. Know your limitations, understand the environment, include a TAM, get your operations trained, know how to do your architecture decisions. So look at those first 5 items. They go back to people. Even though in this presentation we didn't want to focus on people, we wanted to focus on technology and security, it does go back to people. And then we see anti-pattern. So why did you make a particular decision? That was really important because what someone will do, I guarantee it, someone will come back to you and say, you used Veeam and Storage Gateway and that was a stupid decision. And then you're like, no, this is all the tools that we looked at and this is the decision we made and why we made it. So you got to document that stuff. And then work directly with the application owners and get them involved. And that's also a people thing. So a lot of the lessons learned out of this, although there's some really cool patterns on how to use their different tools out there and technologies, what they learned at the end of the day was a lot around people. So the last thing I want to leave you with, and Matt works with all these ISV partners, and I like to say in a migration, is that it does take a village. AWS Professional Services was involved with this. We had some of our SI partners involved with this migration. We had our ISV partners involved in this migration. So it takes a lot of folks to help you with the migration because it's not your core competency. So look to get help from people. And I don't know if Matt has anything to say on that as well or anything around
the other
security.
thing is that what's interesting about this story in particular is that what we talked about today was just a part of the migration, actually. The migration, if I'm not mistaken, is well over 500 servers now and continuing to grow. But not only that, but the migration is continuing in AWS. And it's really important to get the migration done, to do it in phases, but also to adapt once you're in the cloud. And I think this is arguably the most important thing from my perspective is use tools like App Dynamics is a great partner in this space, New Relic and others that can do application profiling. And once you get into the cloud and get it running smoothly, you can further optimize, perhaps embrace spot instances, move to new stacks, move to managed services. It's a continuing journey. And I think Andy Jassy touched on this in the keynote this morning, is that it never stops. So once the migration is complete, that's just one baby step. And we have a lot of tools in our ecosystem and solutions architects and other people who can help you to continue to migrate forever once you're in the cloud and continue to optimize and save costs and improve performance. One last note, there's a mobile app. If you haven't been doing it already, we're always looking for feedback on these sessions. You're able to rate this session and the other sessions you attended in the mobile app. So we really look to those metrics to help us improve for next time. We're a little short on time, but we will be taking questions maybe after the session. Tom and I will hang out in the front here, and then we can continue talking outside as well after. But we appreciate your time. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.